Hello, good morning. How is everybody? Can everybody hear me? Yeah, great. Well, good morning and welcome to Stratbase ADRi's second virtual roundtable discussion, or vRTD. Uh, Today we're discussing, the topic is addressing the COVID-19 economic impact through public-private partnership. My name is Paco Pangalangan. I'm the Executive Director of Stratbase ADRi. As you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has rocked not only the healthcare systems around the world, but economies as well. For the Philippines, infrastructure development through the administration's flagship Build, Build, Build program will play a key role in the country's economic recovery moving forward. That said, this is why ADRi partnered with Citizen Watch Philippines to organize this discussion with our panel of expert speakers and reactors. Now, so that we can officially begin our vRTD, I wanted to pass you on to Stratbase ADR Institute's president, Mr. Dindo Manhit, for his opening remarks. Mr. Manhit? Sir, I think you're on mute. Still on mute. Let's see if I can do something from my end.
The host.
There we go. There we go.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Thank you.
Go ahead, sir.
Good morning to everyone. Welcome to our virtual roundtable. We've been hosting roundtables since 2014, but this pandemic has maybe brought us to this new reality of communicating through what we call virtual roundtables. So allow me to welcome everyone, especially our speakers, Senator Grace Poe, Congressman Edgar Mary Sarmiento, Toti Chiquiamco, a known political economist, president of FEF, and our academic who just published with us a paper on PPP and water privatization, Dr. Phil Torio, who's actually in British Columbia during this lockdown, and the rest of our reactors, participants in this seminar, stakeholders. Allow me to start this discussion by sharing with you a quote that triggered this roundtable topic. When I saw this statement of Secretary Sonny Dominguez, where he emphasized last May 12 that the infrastructure program remains to be the best driver of economic growth. It got me to write in my regular commentary in the Philippine Daily Inquirer, and I entitled it, "We Heal Faster with Collaboration." Just 3 days after that, I would like to emphasize this first line. As we enter this new normal, we need to sustain government-business coordination to win the war against COVID-19. And that has led me to remind also our team that maybe in ADR Institute, we should encourage public-private partnership. Just last January, we published a special study by one of our scholars, Dr. Epictetus Patalinghu, Lingling as we call him, where he emphasized economic infrastructure is considered to be linked to economic growth. And I remember him using the word build, build, build is one he calls a big push infrastructure program. And he said that one of the lessons that can be learned from this experience, not only in the Philippines, but in other countries, is that private participation in infrastructure can increase efficiency and bring expertise. But possible risks can occur, must be understood in order to determine the appropriate regulatory framework. Since 2016, when the government of President Duterte came in, we have tracked this program. We have seen it through 2017. Our own president even hailed the shift to ODA instead of PPP, even attended conferences like One Belt, One Road. We saw the rise of partnership with Japan, 2018, we continue to wait for where we are. But one thing noticeable for us that has been tracked by our research and intelligence team is that last November, it seems that there was an acceptance that the Build program needs to revisit PPP. And here we are now in 2020. And we know that given the challenges confronting government, we need to ask ourselves, this critical component of sustaining economic growth, addressing what is lacking in Philippine economy, needs to revisit really the public-private partnership. I've been a professor of governance for more than 2 decades, and I've always emphasized governance even before the turn of the century. And that's what PPP is all about. Different societal actors working together. And where are we now? We have to accept the slow progression of the BBB program or the Build program. What we need is greater participation from the private sector and other stakeholders through public-private partnership. That's why with this, early on, I think first day of May, Strat-based ADRi Institute came out with a statement. And I'd like to quote a part of it, where we said infrastructure development through the administration's flagship Build program will play a key role in the country's economic recovery moving forward. But the government needs to move itself away from unreliable Chinese investments and rely more on public-private partnership with Filipino businessmen or businesses to invest in its infrastructure programs. Done right, public-private partnership also had added benefit of promoting transparency and accountability, since both the public and the private sector ensures the delivery of services of the mutually agreed upon contract. Today, here we are in our virtual RTD, and I'm happy even to share a commentary that I just wrote for Philippine Daily Inquirer, whereby I speak of good governance is vital in attracting investments that would strengthen economic resilience, improve transportation and connectivity, and create jobs that provide income security. Only through the private sector's uninterrupted and robust participation can we survive through the pandemic and on this new normal way of life and work. Again, welcome and good morning. Thank you for joining us in this virtual RTD. Thank you, Paco, for allowing me to open this roundtable discussion.
Yes, sir. Of course, thank you, sir, for making this vRTD possible, for your leadership as well. Before we move on to our speakers, let me just lay down some house rules, so to speak. If you would like to ask some questions, please use the Q&A function of our Zoom webinar platform. As much as possible, try to address the questions to the speaker to whom you want to ask it. And also please mention your name and your organization. So that said, I would like to introduce to everybody here, to all of our participants, almost 200 participants. Our first speaker, Senator Grace Poe, the chairperson of the Senate Committee on Public Services. Senator Grace, the floor is yours.
Paco, I think
yes,
Senator Grace is not ready. We could turn over to Congressman Sarmiento first.
Of course. Representative Edgar Mary Sarmiento, who is also a chairperson of the House of Representatives. For the House Committee on Transportation, Congressman Sarmiento. Please, yeah.
Thank you so much. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, folks.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
This is something so abnormal during these normal times, really. Fellow speakers, reactors, officers of Strat-based ADRi Institute, good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me as one of the speakers of today's virtual forum. Addressing the COVID-19 economic impact through public-private partnership. It is so hard to address something our generation has never experienced before. War's question is, when will it last? With almost a total global economic shutdown, both government and private sectors leaders are at a total loss where to start. From the Great Depression to wars, humanity, however, always finds a way out. This time it's a war of an unseen enemy that humanity is facing. Yet the last time we had a war, when our country's sovereignty was at stake, and these were during World War II. Yet, to our reactors and fellow speakers, our leaders at the time took the risk of having our own independence despite Manila in total ruin. And this is in 1946. Question was it right or wrong? It's history. However, I want everybody to take note that the GDP 74 years ago was only 4.9 billion, and this is in 1946. 2019 GDP is at 18.5 trillion pesos. Not bad. We've gone a long way. However, it went through so many ups and downs. Sayang. Yet we survived. Resiliency is the word. But for me, it should not only be resiliency. It has to be efficiency, and there should be continuity. In the House of Representatives, we are passing a lot of measures now, the bill to address economy. Stimulus to start with. Of course, we have the Philippine Economic Stimulus Act. It went through, I don't know, second reading already last night. It's around 1.3 billion. And we also have another one coming in that's around, this is what we call CURE or COVID-19 unemployment reduction stimulus. It's around 1.5 billion. Again, the question is where to source the fund. However, we have one thing that's a good credit rating. Stimulus packages is around 6% only of GDP, compared to an average right now is being utilized in terms of number by developed countries, which is around 25%. But to jumpstart the economy, government should not commit the same mistake of borrowing, risking the gains, the financial gains that are already in place. And of course, our president of Stratbase, Professor Dean Dominguez, is very right from his opening statement that really government should have focused more on PPP. And you're right again, that infrastructure is one thing to jumpstart economy. Build is still a priority. But I say PPP, public-private partnership, rather than borrowing. There are a lot of ongoing PPP projects, of course, the likes of the Cavite Barge Terminal of ICTSI, LRT Line 1 extension of Ayala and Metro Pacific. We have one very beautifully ongoing right now, which I can see from the air and has witnessed the development, the progress of project, of course, the Cebu Cordova Link Expressway by Metro Pacific Tollways and the Cavite Laguna Expressway by MPIC Tollways. Currently, I just want everybody to know there are 5 bills pending in the House to strengthen PPP. And these are, of course, House Bill 77 by Joyce Salceda. We have another one, of course, by El Ferte. We have from Rufus Rodriguez, from Roman Garin. These are to strengthen what is right now an executive order in terms of creation, which is the PPP Center. And we want to institutionalize public-private partnership. However, my only wish is, again, continuity and consistency. Please do remember, it's so sad to know that we elect a president every 6 years. And the reality of the ground, once you have a new president, everything changes. Sometimes you backtrack and try to investigate ongoing projects, which causes delay again, easily for 2 years. This should never happen again. If ever only I can, which I'm doing right now, we have to legislate major infrastructure roadmap for us to have continuity. I filed, of course, House Bill 90, which is to legislate the major projects of the Department of Transportation. And there are other House bills pending, and I'm hoping that this will all pass to support what we call the public-private partnership. And mind you, we just passed House Bill 78, the Public Service Act, and have to work hard for the retention of the ports, both airports and seaport, to make sure that for security reason, it has to be in total control of government, if not for Filipino entities. As a chairman of the Committee on Transportation, we're doing something on mass public transportation because I think the president has already made the pronouncement that Metro Manila will now be put down to GCQ, and maybe you can see some barriers being put on EDSA. This was planned before, and it is my hope and wish that it will be properly executed. The bus consolidation that will have an end result of a well-planned route rationalization to make sure that the commuting public will have a public transportation to ride during GCQ, considering the minimum health requirement of the Department of Health and IATF. Again, PPP is very vital to economy. I'm hoping that the big players out there will seriously consider this, and government as well, to look at PPP first rather than borrowing money. Again, Professor Dindo was very right. And this is a common question. Why do we have to borrow money from China when the cost of borrowing is very high? A lot of not so good indicators are now being presented to government, like countries that are suffering right now because of huge borrowing has an end result of the sovereign, in fact, guarantee of the state, sometimes to a point the state can no longer manage borrowing. It's so sad to know. I'll take this opportunity before I end to thank you guys, the different companies who help government one way or another in addressing our fight against COVID-19. And I'm hoping that the executives really, in all seriousness, should really consider focusing back to PPP, which is the right formula for me, moving this country forward. I have a timeline, and this is 2046. 100 years from the time we had our real independence. We already used 74 years. We have 26 more years to go. And in my watch, as a public servant, as a chairman of the Committee on Transportation, as a civil engineer by profession, as a contractor myself, I want to do something which is right for this country in terms of development. And one of those that will be supportive of public-private partnership to move this country forward for the betterment of Filipinos. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much for the opportunity. I would like to thank again Strat-based ADRi Institute for inviting me as one of your speakers. Good morning, everyone. Again, I wish and hope that executives will really look at public-private partnership. Magandang umaga po sa ating lahat. Salamat po.
Thank you, Kong Edgar, for the points that you shared. I agree with you that we need to formalize the country's transportation infrastructure project plan so that we will continue flawlessly, even if we cross over to another administration. Thank you for filing the House bill, sir. Just a few questions.
Yes.
How do you think should the government assist and accommodate companies interested in investing infrastructure projects? Could you identify possible ways, sir?
Again, please repeat the question.
How should the government assist and accommodate companies interested to invest in infrastructure projects? Could you identify possible ways?
Well, for public-private partnership, we do have a center right now. It's called PPP Center. And this is a center where unsolicited proposals are submitted. What is lacking here is that we don't have a roadmap on what are the projects that should be nominated by PPP. That's why I have to file a House bill to institutionalize PPP and make this office as a roadmap with NEDA to first come up with the different projects that this country needs. Now, not only in Luzon, but should include Visayas and Mindanao as well, to make sure that the projects really are the projects needed by this country. If only somebody will be interested. This is a very ambitious project, mind you. Again, it's a link that should connect supposedly Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. The cheapest access right now, I'm hoping that I'm getting your time, is of course towards the eastern seaboard. But to answer your question again, we have a PPP center which was set up by government to help investors who are willing to look at PPP, and I'm hoping that they will have to shorten the time to encourage investors. And we here in the legislative branch of government should make sure to assist as well that investment of these PPP projects are secured and there's no backlash from any incoming administration. Then to do that, we just have to legislate.
Thank you, sir. Another question, sir. What is your assessment on how government worked with the private sector on the implementation of the enhanced community quarantine, especially now as we transition as well to the general community quarantine?
Well, the private sector can really do help a lot, because really the government is right now just case in point, social amelioration. Government is even having a hard time just in releasing to 18 million families. We are still on the first tranche, and we really need private sector to help government on big ticketed project. That's where, for me, that's where private sector should come in. On other projects needed in different parts of the country that we can give to the government, but for major ticket projects that will help government, transportation, water, major infrastructure, I think that has to be given to private sector. We need right now the importance of private sector coming in, because lesson learned in life, in terms of efficiency, that's where private sector is coming in.
Thank you, Congressman. Paco, I turn over the mic to you again to introduce our next speaker.
Yes, yes. Before I introduce our next speaker, though, I wanted to retroactively introduce you. That was our COO of the Stratbase Group, Mr. RP Manhit. And RP was just asking a couple of questions, which he got from the Q&A questions from the panel, from the what do you call this, the participants. So I encourage everybody to use the Q&A feature so that your questions can be seen and asked to the participants. Okay, so thank you, RP, and thank you, Congressman Sarmiento. Next up, we have our next speaker, Senator Grace Poe, who, as I said earlier, is the chairperson of the Senate Committee on Public Services. So, Senator Grace, the floor is yours, po.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning, po.
Okay, so we begin. Governments and their economic managers the world over face a major dilemma today. Should one spend as much as is necessary to save the economy from collapse, or should one pull its punches so as to preserve its fiscal position and creditworthiness? I'm no economist, but it seems to me that countries with the means like Japan and Singapore, and even Malaysia and Thailand have not hesitated in opting for the former approach. For if the economy does indeed collapse, will not the bill for its resuscitation be larger than what it might cost to prevent the collapse? Or as they say here, isn't a centavo of prevention worth more than a peso of cure? But perhaps we need not get into that debate here. Maybe there's a way of minimizing costs of the said trade-off. A large part of our government's rescue plan consists of accelerating its long-delayed build, build, build program. This, in my view, is a sound idea and pretty much takes off from the blueprint of China's response to the global financial crisis, wherein it built roads and bridges all over the country, even in areas where there was no traffic, if just to keep its companies busy and workers employed. But this, I believe, brings forth an opportunity to revive a previously discarded concept that potentially reduces the trade-off between saving the economy and preserving our fiscal health, the public-private partnership, or what we have come to know as PPP. The Department of Finance has stated that its fiscal response to the COVID pandemic adds up to 9% of GDP. So, or thereabouts, depending on how you count it. It says that it puts us squarely at the middle of the pack when compared with the fiscal packages of other countries. Its reluctance to spend more, despite the higher incidence of joblessness and hunger that will result in an economy with the size of our no work, no pay sector, rests on a desire to preserve our credit rating and our ability to keep spending should a second wave of infections occur. So therein lies the opportunity to remind policymakers of the financial advantages of PPP over government-funded projects. The shifting of project costs from the taxpayer to the user of the project's services. A senator with my pro-poor advocacies needs no convincing. By contracting out the undertaking of large projects that are commercially viable, the government can free up funds to spend on healthcare and poverty alleviation programs. However, unlike China, we need not build unused infrastructure to stimulate the economy. Obviously, we have a need for more infrastructure to create employment opportunities and improve the day-to-day lives of our fellow Filipinos. For example, in the transport sector, not only must we do our best to save the jobs of our transport services providers, but there are also opportunities to build useful and relevant infrastructure projects which will decongest EDSA and provide opportunities for PPPs right here at the heart of the economic crisis. We already have the NLEX-SLEX connector road of Metro Pacific and San Miguel. There's also a suggestion from a group, the Move as One Coalition, which proposes engaging 3,000 bus operators and 15,000 other PUVs through service contracts. Now, they also propose projects to improve the walking and cycling infrastructure so that we aren't so dependent on our traffic-causing vehicles. But by also contracting the drivers of the PUVs, then they will eliminate the pressure on these drivers to come up with the amount to pay for their quota at the end of the day. Another thing is they also propose infrastructure projects like, this is a no-brainer, more bus stops that are strategic, bus-only lanes, depots, and terminals. This amounts to about 110 billion pesos. But their study indicates that we will actually recoup 373 billion in returns over 3 years. This will include 34 billion pesos in transport jobs retained and 78 billion pesos in avoided job losses for commuters. However, I'm also aware of the old maxim in public policy that if a private sector project becomes unprofitable, it is shareholders' money that will be lost. But if a government corporation becomes unprofitable, it is the taxpayers who will pay. We all know what happens here. In the coming year, the GOCC will simply ask for a larger budget. I will go no further into detail on the merits of PPP here, as well as the conditions under which the arrangement can work to satisfy the criteria of efficiency and fairness. There are experts in this forum. Off the top of my head, I can name already two who can easily contribute on the nuances of the matter. The esteemed Romy Bernardo and Cosette Canilao, who used to head the PPP Center. Honestly, I could spend all day pointing out all the movers and shakers in attendance who could contribute to our economic revival. But I will say, our government has so far been reluctant to back PPP due to the perception that the private sector has abused the system by corrupting regulators and negotiating for itself terms that are supposedly favorable to its shareholders and onerous to the consuming public. Justified or otherwise, the brouhaha over the water crisis is but one example of how the public is sensitive over these supposed abuses. On this note, I would just like to appeal to the private sector and ask that should it succeed in persuading government to embrace the PPP mode of financing, please take on the responsibility of behaving in a social responsible manner. And also us in government. And I encourage those of us in government to respect contracts. Play fair, play by the rules, and keep the public interest in mind. I understand that your shareholders need to make a return on their investment, but if the consuming public loses out in the end, it will only reinforce the government's suspicions towards PPP and take us back to the default alternative: government undertaking projects and all the inefficiencies and frustrations that come with the territory. However, if we were to encourage PPPs, there's still one major economic stumbling block. With every sector of the economy needing credit extensions and even bailouts, local capital may not be enough. Banks are constrained in lending by many regulations. Recovering from this crisis may require opening up our country to more foreign direct investments. These investments will provide the capital infusion needed by several industries, including manufacturing, transportation, logistics, and perhaps even telecom. Take, for example, internet access. Internet access used to be considered a luxury, but now that physical contact can be life-threatening, it has become a necessity. In order to create competition, drive down the financial burden on consumers, and increase the speed of the internet, we may need to explore other options. Another example is transportation. I just mentioned earlier the potential for PPPs in the transport sector, but even in this sector, access to quality and efficient services remains limited. What I'm trying to get at is, at the moment, our laws restrict foreign ownership in public services. Hence, I filed a bill amending the Public Services Act. This bill seeks to liberalize the economy. This would encourage the entry of more players and capital investments. This in turn will enhance competition, leading to better consumer services. Naturally, there are those who fear that foreign ownership of vital industries could pose threats to national security, and understandably so if we are not careful. However, increasing FDIs and promoting national security should not be conflicting goals. The country can have both, as other countries have, as long as safeguards are observed. Under our bill, the National Security Council has the power to review, and the President may suspend or prohibit FDI transactions if they involve critical infrastructure that threatens to impair the national security of our country. Change can be uncomfortable, but if we do not move forward, obviously, we will get left behind. However, more importantly, for the batch of students who just graduated online, for your sons and daughters or even grandchildren who are now first-time job seekers, a liberalized economy may keep them from leaving home. The PSA might just provide the market diversification needed so that our best and our brightest need not leave our beloved country. Before I end my speech today, I would just like to say thank you to the organizers, Dindo and RP Manhit, Stratbase. Thank you to all the companies that have kept their employees despite the uncertainty. Thank you to all the entrepreneurs who are continuing to create jobs and opportunities despite the pandemic. And last but not least, all the private sector donors and volunteers who remain anonymous but give with open hearts. You are the true heroes. We public servants are merely doing our jobs. Thank you for rising above and beyond the call of duty. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Senator Grace, for your continued support for the public infrastructure sector. Rest assured, the company representatives here in this forum heard your appeal to them on how to treat its users in case we move to PPP. We are one with you in the hope of government respecting contracts between government and the private sector. We look forward to bills like the Public Service Act to be passed soon, since this has also passed the House of Representatives, in order for us to encourage more investors for this sector. Just a few questions, ma'am, before I let you move on to your Senate hearing. Just a few questions from our participants.
Go ahead.
Earlier this month, the DBM reduced the budget for infrastructure development. Other than encouraging PPP, what are other ways can the government maximize its remaining budget to accelerate infrastructure development in the country?
You know, that's also the question many ask me. Is the government going to realign? Are they going to cut certain projects? And this is going to be the topic of our discussion this morning in the finance hearing. There are several economic stimulus bills that are that were filed in the Senate. And from my understanding of most of them, the most important thing that they will try to achieve is to continue our economic growth by providing more jobs. And from what I also understand, most of my colleagues here are one in our agreement that these infrastructure programs should not be put in the back burner. In fact, this will be key to creating jobs, not just through PPPs, but other means that the government can help fund it. There will be realignment from other government-owned and controlled corporations so that there will actually be a source for the funding for these projects. So rest assured that at least I'm one with you in the belief that the infrastructure projects should continue, because this will be also the backbone of our economy. If our infrastructure is not at par with others, it will not be very enticing for foreign investors to actually come here. In fact, we've lost many of them.
Thank you, ma'am. Another question regarding PPP. What should be the safety nets that should be in place in case the government decides to move back to the PPP model so that companies could not dominate the infrastructure industry?
Are you saying that, I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? It was a little bit,
Okay.
I couldn't hear.
In case the government moves back to PPP, what should be the safety nets that should be in place in order for companies not to dominate the infrastructure industry?
It's important, first of all, that there's an actual fair assessment of who's qualified to get a contract. I believe that if we each have a stake in a particular project, then we are invested and we want to make sure that this will succeed. For our own maybe goals, but we should be able to combine those goals together for the government to be able to provide service and to fulfill their promise to their constituents, and for the private sector to their shareholders. So from the very beginning, these contracts, these bids and proposals should be vetted by highly qualified and credible individuals in government. And this will also save us the heartache later on trying to backtrack on our commitments and not honoring contracts, which will be this not only bad for the private sector or for the person or for the company that won the contract, but for the government as well and its reputation for other future investors. So the number one is the vetting process. It should be transparent. It should accommodate those that are truly qualified. And number two, once we've sealed the deal, let us make sure that it is not disadvantageous to either one of the parties involved. And if the representative of either the private sector or the government sector is found to have did anything, they should actually be held accountable so that this will not be repeated in the future. So I will encourage as much PPP projects as we can accommodate and as the private sector can absorb. I really think that if we save money in government, we can use that for other programs that are definitely also needed by our constituents, the social amelioration programs that we are now rolling out, and many others, and education and health that still continues to be something that is of a challenge to our government. So if there are more companies that are interested in PPPs, for as long as they're vetted properly and the process is transparent, I would encourage it.
Thank you, ma'am, for answering that question. Last question, non-PPP related. What is your assessment on the private sector's role in helping the government to fight COVID-19?
Honestly, I think that it was the private sector that acted immediately when this happened. It was through the private sector efforts that we had mass testing immediately. Even the quarantine sites was set up by many private sector groups. As you know, and I'm saying this because I'm also part of government. But it seems like obviously the private sector moves quickly compared to the government. And so that's why at the end of my speech, I think it's fitting that we really also thank the private sector for their efforts, because frankly, without your support, the government could definitely not have done it or achieve what it has at this point. There's still a lot to be done. But compared to other countries, I think also that our private sector here is really stepping up. Even the donations of the PPEs came from the private sector initially. And in fact, the procurement now by government just really arrived last April 23. But before that, you have different companies already converting their factories to producing frontline necessities that are being used until today. So there's your answer.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for participating and joining us.
Thank you for your invitation.
Thank you, ma'am. Paco, I'll pass it on to you again.
Okay, thank you, Senator Graceful. Thank you, RP, for those questions. Next up, we'll be moving on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is the president of the Foundation for Economic Freedom, Mr. Calixto Totti Chiquiamco. Mr. Chiquiamco, ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Speak, Senator Grace Poe, Congressman Edgar Sarmiento, fellow speakers, reactors, ladies and gentlemen. It's too bad that at the start, this administration saw the private sector as greedy private parties so that it wanted to go it alone, particularly in building infrastructure projects. It signaled BBB, or Build, Build, Build program, via Official Development Assistance in the General Appropriations Act, or the government budget. The administration term hasn't ended, but we already know the ending of the story. None of the BBB's bold and ambitious goals will be attained. The BBB program rested on the faulty assumption that the government had the money and the competence, but although it may have had the money, it didn't have the competence and wherewithal. Now, with the pandemic consuming most of the government's resources, the government doesn't even have the money. It may have no choice but to see the private sector as valuable partners rather than enemies to be demonized in healing the damage to public health and to the economy that the pandemic has caused. The problem is that the game has changed. For obvious reasons, airport projects are no longer attractive to the private sector. Limited mobility also means that toll roads may not result in a positive rate of return. Revenues from concessionaires like restaurants and retail shops, which could help offset the low margins from tolls or fees, won't be around. The economics of private sector participation for infrastructure may no longer be there. This doesn't mean that PPP shouldn't be pursued. On the contrary, PPPs are more needed now than ever, particularly in light of corruption and inefficiency associated with most government projects. Designed in the right way, solicited PPP projects can be a win-win for the Filipino people. In light of the pandemic crisis, the PPP mode should be used in two areas: public health and public transportation for the new normal. In the case of public health, let's implement the universal healthcare law along PPP lines. One idea is to privatize most government hospitals, including the specialty hospitals like Philippine Heart Center and the National Orthopedic. Not only would privatization raise money for the government, but it would improve efficiency and reduce corruption in the delivery of healthcare. Another idea, which I wrote about in my column for economic recovery, is to build out public health in the various regions to PPP providers and pay those PPP providers on the basis of agreed health outcomes, such as morbidity, hospital stays, infant mortality, patient experience, increased life expectancy, etc. This outcome-based reward framework will promote this prevention and produce innovations, such as telemedicine, rather than the present PhilHealth system, which rewards more procedures and unnecessary interventions. It pays for outcomes it pays for processes, which means more dialysis, more operations, and more medicines, all of which are prone to overpricing and corruption. However, all of this won't happen unless PhilHealth itself is reformed. It should be reformed with a governance structure similar to the Social Security system, with participation in the board by patient and private sector representatives. The PPP mode should also be explored in revamping our present chaotic public transportation system under the new normal. First, let's accept the fact that the government is a poor operator of public transport. MRT and PNR are examples, and therefore should be privatized. Second, I believe my FEF colleague, ADRi, is proposing reforming the present chaotic and inefficient bus system for the new normal under a bus rapid transit system. If so, all I can advise him is never let the government be the operator. Let it be a PPP. Perhaps two private concessionaires or two consortia of private operators may be allowed to operate it. This can lead to salary-based drivers and innovations, such as the use of apps to gauge demand and do dispatch. Before I end, I would like to add that Senator Grace Poe is correct. The Public Service Act amendment to liberalize foreign ownership in telecommunications and transport is needed in order to invigorate PPP projects and enable more and better qualified proponents in the PPP game. The PSA is needed in order to bounce back from the negative effects of the pandemic. Thank you, Senator Poe, for championing the PSA bill in the Senate. Finally, to sum up, the COVID crisis is an opportunity for the government to pivot back towards solicited PPP, which has proven in the past to be a win-win for Filipino taxpayers and consumers. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Totti. If it's okay, po, I have a couple of questions for you here, po.
Okay.
The first is, you mentioned earlier that government is running out of resources due to the pandemic. Do you see, aside from PPP, any other industries that perhaps could be tapped for more activity, that could be supported for more activity to generate funds for the government?
Again, can you repeat
yes,
the question?
Sure, Paul. You mentioned earlier that the government is running out of resources.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other industries that are being underutilized or untapped that you think the government should revisit in order to generate more revenue?
Oh, well, I think the pandemic has shown that the basic infrastructure really should be upgraded and developed. These are, of course, the basic industries, that's power, telecommunications, transport, all of these basic industries need more players, more competition, and more investments. While, for example, telecommunications was shown to be very important, and now it's going to be important, especially with the drive toward e-learning and distance education. Therefore, there should really be a focus on these basic industries like telecommunications. for PPP projects.
I see. Okay, sir. I have another one po, a second question here from the participants. What is your assessment of the collaboration so far of the public sector and the private sector? Do you have any thoughts on this? Is there room for improvement in terms of collaboration and consultation?
I think the important thing is to set and define the rules of the game. Because any attempt to change contracts in the middle of the project would really have a negative effect on us. I think government also has to determine whether in a PP project, whether it wants to maximize revenue or it wants to lower the cost to the consumers, because those two are opposing objectives. No, so I think that's why I think there's a need to have a PPP law to exactly specify the rules of the game. And once it is set, then there is no more going back on it. No, so that's what's important in order to be able to make sure that contracts are respected.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for answering those questions, Mr. Chiquiamco. I will now introduce our next speaker, if that's all right po. We'll move on now to Dr. Philomer Torrio. Dr. Torrio is a professor at the Ateneo School of Government, and he also is the author of an upcoming ADRi special study on Metro Manila's water privatization. Dr. Phil Torrio, good evening po. I know that you're in Canada. We're glad to have you here with us today. Sige po, Dr. Torrio.
Well, magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. According to a recent International Monetary Fund study, the COVID-19 pandemic will cause the global economy to contract by 3% in real terms in 2020, with real output contraction of about $9 trillion in 2020 and 2021. Without mitigating measures, NEDA estimates a reduction in real Philippine GDP growth to minus 0.6% to 4.3%. In fact, the country's first quarter GDP growth was minus 0.2%, which ended a 20-year growth streak. As one of the priority measures to relaunch economic growth, the Philippine government decided to accelerate the Build program. More so, the NEDA chief has stated that the government is open to increasing private sector participation in infrastructure projects to ensure enough fiscal space for this relaunch. And given the current state of the global economy, the Philippines is in competition with other developing countries for reduced levels of foreign investments and debt. While tax reform and incentives for foreign investments are indeed important, allow me to focus on something that takes quite a long time to develop, but is oftentimes taken for granted. And by this, I mean investor confidence. And allow me at this time also to use the Metro Manila water privatization as an example. In December 2019, the Philippine government threatened to cancel the Metro Manila water concessions unless the so-called onerous provisions are removed. For today, I would like to focus on the provisions which are contained in the government's performance undertaking letter to the concessionaires, namely the prohibition against rate-setting interference by the national government, payment for losses arising from such interference, and payment for early contract termination. A more complete discussion can be found in the study entitled Metro Manila's Water Privatization, Making Sense of the So-Called Onerous Provisions. But at this time, let us take a historical perspective of the water privatization program for better appreciation of the time, money, and effort put in by the private concessionaires to bring the service levels to where they are today. Around 16.4 million people in Greater Metro Manila now have 24-hour supply of water that is of good quality and adequate pressure. Note that improving to such service levels cost the concessionaires around 374 billion pesos. Contextually as well, this privatization may be regarded as one of the world's largest and longest running privatization programs for a water utility. However, looking back to 1997, the scenario was very different. At that time, the two private concessionaires still needed to avail of multi-million-dollar loans to support capital investment programs worth $7 billion over a period of 25 years. As in any water PPP project, or any PPP project for that matter, each concession company was just a shell company without any track record in water utility operations, construction, and loan repayments. Moreover, all of its personnel would come from a pool of former MWSS officers and staff. Essentially, the main asset of the company was the concession agreement, which the government's privatization team hoped would address the concerns of the bidders and the lenders as well. Although the country already had power privatization projects in place, there was practically no benchmark for the Metro Manila water privatization in the country or elsewhere in the region. In this regard, one may rightfully associate many uncertainties to the project, thus increasing investment and lending risks. In particular, political, contractual, and regulatory risks may have been concerns of foreign investors and creditors alike. Would the concession agreements be honored by the succeeding administrations? Would contractual covenants be religiously adhered to? Would the regulatory agency be capable of performing tasks critical for the continuity of the program? These were proper questions to ask for a program that was being introduced not only here in the Philippines, but also for the rest of the developing world. And given that privatization PPP projects are financed more by debt rather than stockholders' equity, in some cases by as much as 2 times, the lenders would tend to have stronger aversion to risk. Furthermore, given the nature of project finance, the financing mode for privatization and PPP projects, the lenders would have to rely mainly on the project cash flows and the accompanying contracts. How then do you provide comfort to the project finance lenders? Towards this end, the concession agreement must contain provisions that provide some degree of assurance on the repayment of loans incurred by the concession company. Tariff issues are also of great interest to the lenders. Requests for tariff increases are reviewed and decided upon by the MWSS Regulatory Office. In this regard, the government's performance undertaking states that the national government will not cause the reduction or non-implementation of tariffs already approved by MWSS. The reason for this might be political in nature, particularly if the approved tariff increase will be implemented during an election year. If the national government does not interfere with the tariff setting, the performance undertaking, if the national government does interfere with the tariff setting, the performance undertaking letter also states that the state becomes liable for losses incurred by the concessionaires. For any tariff dispute, any decision by the appeals panel is final and binding on the two parties in arbitration. Any interference by the national government on the implementation of the panel's tariff decision will again fall within the ambit of the performance undertaking letter. If for any reason the dispute remains outstanding after the conduct of arbitration proceedings, either party may call for the termination of the concession agreement. In such case, the concession company will be entitled to an early termination payment, part of which will be used to repay the loan in full. In the performance undertaking letter, the national government guarantees full payment of the early termination amount in exchange for all assets built into the water system, for which the concessionaires have now spent around 374 billion pesos. These three onerous provisions, so-called onerous provisions, which perform part of the performance undertaking letter, provides the necessary comfort to the project finance lenders and helps them decide in favor of extending the much-needed financing to the concession company. Without this financing, it is highly doubtful that the concessionaires would be able to fully implement its operational and capital investments program. And currently, given the concessionaires' operating and financial track records, with generally no instances of default on existing loans, there is a great possibility that the lenders may relax these loan conditions. As such, there may be room for easing the provisions of the performance undertaking as well. As it was 23 years ago, when the provision of water services in Metro Manila was being offered to the private sector, the matter of investor confidence today is still paramount in attracting local and foreign investors to participate in the government's PPP projects. Without it, these investors may defer participation until the political, contractual, and regulatory risks for these projects are more manageable and predictable, or they may invest elsewhere where such risks are more appreciated and better addressed. Given the current situation, either case would not be beneficial for the country and the Filipino people. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Dr. Torrio. I did forget to mention earlier, Dr. Torrio is the former executive director of the PPP Center as well. Thank you, Dr. Torrio. We actually have more than a couple of questions here for you because you're talking about risk and the PPP side, the private sector side of the PPP contracts. But in the interest of time, maybe I can ask them to you later on during the question and answer portion. And for now, we'll just move on to our reactors. Thank you, Dr. Torrio. Our first reactor for today, we're going to be asking for the reactions of and the insights of Mr. Romy Bernardo, who's here as the Philippine partner of the Global Source Partners. Mr. Romy Bernardo, your insights would be appreciated.
Very good. Thank you so much. In a book titled Momentum that Toti Siquiamco and I co-wrote with 3 other friends last year, Don Padiranga, Raul Fabella, and Noel de Dios, a number of our old columns talked about PPP and the circumstances under which it is the ideal mode for project development and implementation. I was delighted to see that one of my columns there was posted by perhaps former PPP Center Chief Phil, or perhaps earlier by predecessor Cosette in the PPP Center site. The title of that column is The Great Infrastructure Debate. I was threatening earlier to Dindo that I will read it here, but I don't want to take up too much time. You can read it there in the site of PPP Center, or better yet, you can get a copy of our book. This is a book that from Toti It's a publication of the Foundation for Economic Freedom. My column talks about the pros and cons of PPPs using GAA and concludes that given the huge infrastructure requirements of the Philippines, it should not be PPP versus ODA, but rather PPP and ODA. I further noted that, quote, lively debate may have been driven by the sudden change in public policy in 2016, yanking without compelling reason several projects at advanced stages of preparation to an ODA or tax-funded mode after these have been prepared for a PPP bid over many years. This has raised concerns over the consistency and stability of government policies from many capable local and global players who have invested substantial resources to bid for this. Included in these are the 5 regional airports and the Kaliwa Dam. Had the administration pursued these projects, this would likely be already completed and serving the public, especially the much delayed bulk water project. This is what I wrote now. This is water under the bridge, pardon the pun, and we need to move on. And as a policy advocate like the strat-based guys, I believe that we should never let a good crisis go to waste. What then is possible to do in the remaining time? This is what I wrote in a column last week as one of the key reforms that can be done for the third phase of Progreso, the recovery bounce back phase. Quote, more reliance on PPP, including bringing to the finish line projects that have been under protracted negotiations. This can help rebuild damaged investor confidence. It will also help conserve now stretched fiscal resources. Government also needs to assure stability in regulation for existing PPP and enact the long-pending PPP bill in Congress. This will also build on the working public-private partnerships that now taking place in coping with this crisis. Most notably, and Senator Poe was quite eloquent in explaining this, the T3 program, testing, tracing, and treatment, and in helping the most vulnerable members of our society cope with this problem. By the way, this is something no less than the President acknowledged warmly, including with an unexpected kind apologies. Senator Grace, Congressman Sarmiento, Totishi Kiamco identified areas which are good candidates for future PPP reform and collaboration. One, in the area of mass public transport, PUV service contracting, public infrastructure to support the same. Two, open up the economy to more competition in PPP by amending the outdated Public Services Act. And as I mentioned earlier, pass the long-delayed PPP bill. Three, bid out public health projects in various regions for services based on outcomes, as Totti explained. Let me add a fourth one. Water projects are one of the most cost-effective public health interventions that governments in developing countries can do. Peso for peso, I'm willing to bet that it can save more lives from the prevention of deaths of common waterborne diseases, schistosomiasis, cholera, versus other types of public health interventions. For example, the high economic cost of lockdowns to prevent mortality from COVID. Incidentally, hand washing, the most potent tool versus COVID-19, together with wearing face mask, is only possible if there is water. In this connection, I end with a wish that the limbo in which the MWSS water concessions are in, with the setting aside of the arbitrary award that was an outcome of the idiosyncratic regulation during an earlier administration, is sorted out soonest. This will send clear signal, especially at this time that the Philippines is open for investments, and continue to provide us affordable, secure water service by the water concessions over the last 2 decades. And we hope it can continue, something that could not be delivered by the MWSS pre-PPP, as Dr. Phil explained earlier. You will forgive my bias since I was involved in it as a USEC with oversight for privatization in 1996. MWSF's privatization, in my view, remains, as Dr. Phil explained, the best infra PPP case in terms of service delivery and mobilization of financial capital, both debt and equity. Concessionaires achieved these outcomes due to their performance anchored on a credible concession contract, which is now being reviewed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Romy Bernardo. Next up, we have Mr. Coco Alcoaz, the Executive Director of the Makati Business Club. Mr. Alcoaz, the floor is yours, po. Okay. Yeah, though you are on mute.
Yeah.
There you go. There
Thanks.
you go. Yes.
Thanks, Paco. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Senator. Good morning, Congressman. As always, when Dindo invites me to speak at one of his events, I'm always scared to look lightweight beside the people I used to quote when I was a reporter, because they were the source of knowledge and wisdom, and I was not. So I thought maybe I'll just read also from Romy and Toti's book, but I think Dindo will not allow that. So I asked some of my principals, my members, and some friends for ideas to share with you. They don't want to be named, which means that I can hopefully give you some worthwhile ideas in the next 5 minutes. I suspect we're all preaching to the choir here. I suspect we're all pro-PPP and think it would be good for the government to ramp up PPPs using private money to build infra so it can focus on all the new spending that COVID-19 demands. But the admin doesn't favor PPPs. Their words and records show that. And COVID-19, which is a great reason to pivot, doesn't seem to have changed their minds. PH Progreso, unless I'm mistaken, the government's economic recovery plan, says that the first criteria for BBB is quote unquote available fiscal space. No mention of PPP, which would use private sector fiscal space. Allow me to share 4 points from my anonymous friends. My first point is that in a sense, the admin is right, because it takes at least 2 years, as you know more than I do, 2 years or 3 years for a PPP to go from concept to award. The admin may also believe they don't have the luxury of long-term thinking when all their energies have to be focused on the now. My second point is that this may be the wrong way for the admin to think about PPP. There is a reason to think long-term, because the PPPs you start working on today will mean thousands of jobs and multiple contracts and subcontracts 2 or 3 years from now. That could be a big boon when the time comes, given the possibility of an L-shaped or W-shaped recovery. The boon would be dual. First, for the millions of citizens and businesses who will be enabled by the infra. Second, for the businesses building the infra. With PPP, government creates a market for proponent companies to grow, even or especially in this COVID economy, when the government should be grabbing any chance it can to create a market and or outsource work. Just think how much companies like San Miguel, Metro Pacific, Ayala, and others have grown because the government or successive governments created a PPP market. These companies are not contractors or construction companies who would have bid for a government project. They, thanks in part to added scale due to PPP, are our shot at regional and global competitiveness. Instead of government money, they would use their own capital to create infra and thousands of jobs for themselves, contractors, and subcontractors, all of which will be a boon in 2022 or 2023, one of which is an election year. My third point is there are faster PPPs, probably smaller and less glamorous, but a good fit probably for the government's BBB criteria, current BBB criteria of having a strong impact on jobs, poverty, growth, and confidence, and with a high multiplier effects. This can be bundles of, for example, primary healthcare centers or farm-related logistics and storage facilities or similar projects. COVID-19 has shown how critical these are to health, livelihood, and supply. Meanwhile, they are relatively small, taken one by one, and could be quicker to start and complete even when bundled into packages of 10, 20, or 50. My fourth and last point is about how PPPs can help the financial sector, particularly SSS. I remember how many investors and financial institutions said they wanted to invest in the Aquino administration's PPP projects. Little or none of that happened because proponents managed to raise all the money they needed on their own and from cheap loans. We are not the kind of people in this Zoom room who want government telling businesses whom to partner with. On the other hand, individual PPPs and the whole PPP market itself would be a great source of the stable long-term income that SSS, GSIS, private retirement funds, insurers, and other similar institutions need. In particular, SSS will need more and more such investments if it is going to do more for its members in the future, which I know some business leaders want, having been moved by the suffering and the vulnerability of people and therefore the economy that they saw in COVID time. That greedy investment bankers and private insurers and investors will benefit from PPP-linked investments is just a byproduct or a bonus. To close, PPPs tend to take time, so most may not help our short-term need. Second, most PPPs will be a boon in 2 or 3 years' time, especially if we are in a W or L-shaped recovery. Third, there are quick PPPs that can help the economy now. And fourth, PPPs can help us improve social security now that we understand our people's and our economy's insecurity so much better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Coco. Next up, we're going to hear from the chair of the National Issues Committee of the Financial Executives of the Philippines, Mr. Ed Yap. Mr. Ed Yap, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, yes.
Hi, yes, well, we can hear you. Hello? Just checking.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Good.
Yes, po.
Okay, let me start by greeting. Okay, good morning, Senator Grace Po and others, including my president, Toti Chiquiamco of the FEF. Before I start, let me share that at the virtual roadshow of the government's bounce back plan for COVID recovery that I organized yesterday, and as organizer, I presented to Secretary Dominguez a joint statement of 32 business and professional organizations supporting and urging Congress to pass the CREATE Act or revise CITIRA. In this virtual roadshow, economic team members, all 4 of them, presented their plans and initiatives led by Secretary Dominguez. So we're talking of stimulus plans. And this act, when it is passed, is envisioned precisely to do that. So Senator Grace Po and others will be receiving their copy of the joint statement. Let me say that this virtual roadshow had over 15,000 views in Facebook and almost 1,000 in Zoom. Now, I would like to talk of removing obstacles to growth rather than instituting new measures to stimulate. Because I believe that removing obstacles is just as important. Now, public transportation was mentioned several times by Senator Grace Po, FEF President Toti Chiquiamco. Rightly so, because the multi-decade-old traffic and transportation problems have been holding down our economy and inflicting heavy economic costs, estimated previously at 2.4 billion pesos per day in economic opportunities cost, and now likely it has reached 3.5 billion pesos a day. Aside from the unquantifiable social cost, I believe that removal of these obstacles will greatly help recovery from this COVID pandemic crisis. Now, today I have good news to share on traffic and transportation front, which are major concerns of Senator Poe and the opportunities for PPP. Yes, President Toti, I heard you. So may I now proceed to my PowerPoint presentation. Next slide, please. All right, so this is the good news. In a few days, the dry run for the new busways at the innermost lanes will be started. And in fact, preparations are being made. And you can see here in the news that it was announced already by MMDA. Next slide, please. Here, you can see the new busways will be at the innermost lanes adjacent to the MRT instead of the existing yellow bus lanes at the curbside. Now, these bus lanes, you'll see later, have been proven to be ineffective. Next slide, please. Okay, it all started here 5 years ago when I presented my traffic and transportation problems of Manila with a holistic approach solution. Next slide, please. Now, I might as well mention that my presentation followed that infamous 8-hour Carmageddon that you might still remember. Okay, so this was the EDSA Dream Plan that I presented on August 26, 2015. Now look at the center portion. It calls for new busways to be located at the innermost lane to replace the yellow bus lanes. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I have been articulating EDSA bus system reform. Among my articles were EDSA, From Ugly Duckling to Manila Golden Mile, published on December 12, 2019 in the Star, Trackless Train, Easing EDSA's Strain, on December 19, 2019, also at the Philippine Star, and recently, Don't Waste a Crisis, last May 10, 2020 at the Philippine Star. Next slide. Okay, so in this article, I said that a return to the status quo ante chaotic bus service on EDSA and other major traffic corridors would be a horrible option to the public, and that now is the time to introduce a new transportation system on EDSA. Next slide, please. Okay, so a few days following that, I presented my proposal at a forum, virtual forum, hosted by Phoenix. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide will show you the problems and the solution that have been staring at us for decades. The problem is that there are too many vehicles on EDSA. Look at the left and to the right, and you can see also that the yellow bus lanes beside the curb have been ineffective and useless, in fact. Now, the solution is right there at the center. Look at the trackway of the MRT. Regardless of traffic conditions on the left and on the right, the MRT train continues to run. So based on this, I'll show you the solution. Okay. Next slide, please. Next, okay. The solutions should consist of quantitative and qualitative reforms to right-size the bus fleet. And this can be achieved through franchise rationalization, route restructuring, accreditation of qualified operators. Now, I'm pleased to inform you that in a long meeting that I had with the DOTR team, these are being done and it's happening. Next, hand in hand with bus right sizing is the transfer of the yellow bus lanes to dedicated busways at the innermost lane. Without this, the other reforms will be ineffective. Now, we need also high-capacity buses, and these buses must operate like a train to optimize the busway and to increase passenger throughput. Now, for private cars, it's about time that we realize that all this coding, whether color or number, are not working, okay? So instead, we need to impose other measures like congestion fees for cars during peak hours, just like in Singapore. Next slide, please. Now, you know, I should mention that Secretary Tulgade is not happy with the transportation system and the traffic. And he is determined to institute reforms. Now, it will look something like this. The passenger platforms will be at the center, on the island, center island, and on both sides will be the busways. Now, on each side, you will see two lanes. The innermost lane will be for the local buses, and then the outer lane is for express buses or P2P to overtake the local buses at the stations. And then to the extreme right and left will be the lanes for private vehicles. Next slide, please. Okay, now the other concept of this reform is that the buses should operate like a train to optimize the busway. Okay, next, please. Okay. Okay, you know, this here. The previous slide will show you that in some countries with the platform at the center island and the busways, they use at-grade crosswalks for passengers to go from the sidewalk to the platforms. Now, this is a good interim solution pending the construction of air bridges or an underpass, which is the most ideal, just like here in Makati. Okay, now here you will see the objective of this reform is for buses to continue running as in this picture, regardless of traffic condition. Beside the busway, the buses will continue to run without interruption, without being impeded by other vehicles as happening now and before. This way, we optimize the scarce road space. At the same time, commuters will be getting to their destinations quickly. Next slide, please.
Mr. Yap, sorry po, we just had to ping you po that
Yeah, I'm
running out
almost
of
done.
bit of time. Okay, sir. Sige
I'm
po,
almost
thank
done.
you.
In fact, I think this is the last slide.
Perfect,
You know,
perfect, thank you.
indiscriminate loading and unloading has always been a problem. Bus drivers stop wherever they want to pick up or unload passengers. There is a very simple solution that has already been introduced abroad. And it is simply to raise the platform floor of stations, and at the same time, look at the bus. The door, our buses are similar. They are high floor buses. So by raising the platform floor, it will be aligned to the floor of our buses. Okay, I think that's about it. You have now a clear picture of what's going to happen, and I might as well disclose that the dry run will be happening very, very soon.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, po. As
Oh, I
a
should
daily
add,
EDSA, yes,
yeah,
sir.
let me just add with regards to PPP, okay?
Yes, po.
That this presents opportunities. One is that the bus operators may form into a consortium and operate as service contractors under a PPP structure or framework. Now, in addition to this, President Totti knows that I had been advocating for the upgrade of NAIA by private contractors under PPP. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. So next up, to introduce our next set of speakers, I'm going to again reintroduce our COO, Mr. RP Manhit. RP.
Okay, I'll introduce our first stakeholder reactor, Ms. Cosette Canilao. She's the former executive director of the Public-Private Partnership Center. She's currently the president and CEO of Aboitiz Infra Capital.
Very good.
Cosette, you have the floor.
Yes, good morning to all, and hope we are coping well with the COVID pandemic. Now, we've never seen this kind of disruption in our lifetime, in my lifetime at least. The closest that I could associate this this disruption is the 1997 Asian crisis, but that's only contained within Asia, right? But the silver lining is that we have seen how public-private collaboration can be very effective. In the first few weeks when the pandemic broke out and even during lockdown, it was the private sector that stepped up in the interim to provide the immediate solutions while government put together the necessary plans and actions, including legislation, for a medium-term and a more sustainable solution. This highlights the private sector's agility and nimbleness in procurement, logistics, funding, and even in the use of technology. And this is what the private sector brings into PPP contracts, into PPP arrangements. And that's what we want to foster in PPPs. This agility, is the unquantifiable variable that we try to estimate in value for money. In government, we try. I used to be in government before, so we try to calculate what the private sector's value is in a government project, and this is the unquantifiable variable, and this has been highlighted during this pandemic, in the first few weeks of this pandemic. Now, of course, with the reallocation of government funding from infrastructure projects to COVID responses, there is now a gap that needs to be filled by private sector in pursuing the BBB projects in the pipeline. However, for private sector to be enticed and to participate in PPP projects, there needs to be a sound and effective legal framework. So the obligation of putting together an effective PPP framework is the work of the whole of government and not only of the executive. But as we can see, even legislation during pandemic is very key to reviving the economy. So we need to have the proper legislation in place to address the gaps of the existing PPP law, which is the Build, Operate, Transfer law. And the PPP Act, which has been in Congress for the past 5, 6 years, 7 years. We started the amendment of the PPP Act during my time when I was PPP Center head. But that version is, I think, what's in Congress and what's in Senate right now. And that addresses the current gaps of the law, as well as addresses the concerns of the lenders and other stakeholders in PPPs. But aside from that, of course, because of the economic reforms that were done in the previous years, we have a very strong credit rating, and even reforms in the ease of doing business has been put in place with the Anti-Red Tape Act. So that's good. But then again, we need the legislation, the PPP Act, the amendments to the BOT law, to remove certain ambiguity in the processes, in policies, such as, for example, the real property taxes, which up until now it's a source of big friction. And a source of a big source of contention and discussion between the private sector and the government. Second is that we also need clear policies, that address the issues of the lenders and our lenders, because as what Phil Torrio mentioned a while ago, this is a project. This is most PPPs are project finance, and we rely heavily on attracting private on getting funding from lenders, from private finance lenders, and very particular. They're very particular about major provisions in the PPP contract. That can hopefully be followed during force majeure events, and the government action will be guided by that contract. And this pandemic, we're living through a force majeure event. When I was still with government, when we were drafting the template for concession agreements, as well as the circulars that would govern governments in drafting contracts, we tried to think of several scenarios that could happen, that would fall under force majeure, and how government would react to this. I never thought that we'd live through one right now. This pandemic is a classic example of the things we're trying to preempt or to solve. And have answers in our contracts. So I guess the PPP circulars issued by the PPP Center board, the PPP board, they're still true, and I think it's still there. And I hope government would revisit those guidelines, those circulars, because that's been discussed with various stakeholders, with lenders, with contractors, with parties interested in participating in PPPs. And I believe that those circulars are still there in the PPP guidebook, I think, and they're still following it. I hope that is revisited, especially during this very uncertain times, where government wants private sector to come in, and I think that would also entice private sector to still go into PPP arrangements with those guidelines. Next is on the low-hanging fruits. I agree with, Coco pointed out that, PPPs, preparation of, and I think Toti also mentioned that solicited PPPs are better, than other forms of PPPs. But like what Coco mentioned, it would take about 2 years to prepare a PPP for solicited bidding. So that would happen in the next admin. And when I was with the PPP Center, I was also batting, or naively batting for projects that we started in the last admin to still be adopted and continued by the next admin, as that would save government about 2 to 3 years time in terms of putting together its own pipeline of projects via a mode that they're more comfortable with. However, we are where we are, and I think for us to use PPP, to use private participation to revive economy, I hope the government will focus on the projects that are already in the advanced stages. Again, if we stop this, we will lose another 4 or 5 years, and this is where we need it. It's not going to happen probably in the next 2 or 3 years, but we need this injection of private sector participation in infra projects as soon as possible. And let's be practical and take a look at the low-hanging fruits and vet it properly. The last point that I have is what we call recovery phase. So we are now we're hoping that with the laws that are being passed or about to be passed by government, it would and with the projects that are already in the advanced stages, we have to address the impact of this pandemic in the current or in the drafting of our contracts. We cannot avoid it, and we have to address it. And hopefully, in that recovery period, that there would be dynamic collaboration between government and private sector, like what we are seeing now in addressing COVID response. I think the same type of collaboration for infrastructure projects during the COVID period can be achieved. So that's my reaction to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Cosette, for your insights. We hope that you stay for the question and answer portion later. Next off is Mr. Christian Gonzalez. He is the Executive Vice President and Global Corporate Head of ICTSI. He is also a Board Director of Bloomberry Resorts Corporation, Prime Metro Line Infrastructure, and Prime Metro Power. Christian will share his insights on the public-private partnerships. Chris?
Thank you, RP, and good morning to everybody. Look, I'll be very blunt, right? I think my personal opinion is that PPPs in the Philippines have always been driven more by what people think the answer is before actually even knowing what the problem is. I'll speak purely from a port's perspective, right? I have never heard in the 20 years I've been in this industry, we need to look 30 years down the line and handle X amount of containers that will support consumption by Y number of population. And that's where everything should start, because then you have a unified plan that goes from administration to administration, that creates the governance and accountability benefits that you have from actually having a plan that you're meant to stick to. And every single government is able to then say, okay, we did it this way and it was based on that plan, we did a good job. Or no, it wasn't done that way we failed because, again, it didn't achieve what our ultimate goal was. So you sort out governance and accountability that way. You also put yourself in a situation where you aren't creating unnecessary infrastructure, as Senator Grace-Poe said we need to avoid. You create a set of PPPs that are driving an ultimate objective, as opposed to kanya-kanyang project because it suits their particular region or their particular district. So I think, look, we really need to get government to focus on what the problem is and what our long-term solution to that is. And that was also very well articulated by Congressman Sarmiento, right? In his statement related to having a plan for 2046. If we want to be successful with PPPs, we need to base them on a long-term plan. Now, going to the current COVID situation, okay, we're here. You know, everything that's already in place, whether unsolicited or solicited, that's all water under the bridge, right? So how do we tap the low-hanging fruit, as Coco was talking about? Again, going back to ports, you have certain unsolicited proposals that would deliver significant value to the government now in the form of upfront fees, and in the term of recurring revenue over the short term, plus a significant improvement in overall operational capabilities of certain ports. There is no reason to overanalyze these projects. We need to look at them pragmatically. We cannot try to find a perfect contract that spans all these unsolicited proposals for ports. It's virtually impossible to find the same terms for a port project in Davao than for a port project in Manila than for a port project in Iloilo. We need to be pragmatic about that. We need to realize that each one of these places is different. And we need to realize that if we don't act now and get these through, we're basically going to waste 2 or 3 years debating, debating terms in these contracts, and ultimately end up in the same place when the next administration kicks in. So it's like Groundhog Day. So anyway, I mean, look, I think Coco in particular said most of what I wanted to emphasize. But I do encourage all of us to accept the fact that the success of PPPs will come from not looking at the answer first, but rather the problem and the objective, and putting all of those objectives into a timeline which will allow us to create better governance and accountability.
Thanks, Chris, for your inputs. We'll take note of that, and hopefully the participants here would understand it as well. Next in line is Mr. Noel Quintanar. He is currently the Chief Operating Officer of AC Infrastructure Holdings Corporation. Noel also served government as an Undersecretary for Rail and Toll Roads of the Department of Transportation. Noel, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you, RP, and thank you to Starbase and ADRi for inviting Ayala to this forum. I think first of all, and I'd like to pick up on what Coco said, that this is like we're all preaching to the choir and singing in great harmony. But I think nevertheless, it's important at this point in time to really understand what we can do different as a PPP community. And I think this is where I'd like to share our perspectives from Ayala, where picking up on what Senator Poe said earlier in her speech, that there are actually two perspectives which I'd like to highlight in my few comments. One is the perspective of the banks, and two, the perspective of foreign direct investment, which Senator Poe touched on briefly in her speech. And I think it's really important to underscore, we as PPP proponents and people who support this approach to infrastructure development really have to focus as a community in communicating to government that bankability is a key component of what makes a successful PPP. And I think Phil Torrio in his comments also mentioned that there's actually a lot of the investment here is coming from the banks. So the project finance structure is usually 70 or from 50 to 80% funded by the banks, and often they're not actually in the conversation in coming up with the contract, which would drive the PPP or govern the PPP over the next 20-25 years. So I think I want to underscore that bankability is a key concept, and it's not like we have to reinvent the wheel on bankability. As you know, PPP is a well-accepted mode globally, and there are certain parameters and terms in which banks would look at PPP investments favorably. And again, we don't even have to look too far. Even the ADB, as a partner in some of the local banks, has a lot to add to some of our local contracts. And keeping in mind that basically the terms of the debt in a way govern what equity can do, what private equity can do. And I think that's what we really have to focus on moving forward as we try to develop PPPs to meet the new normal. And I think it's quite simple, actually. The banks are basically, the banks and the foreign direct investors, by the way, both of them continue to be interested in the Philippine market, but they're looking for certain things. And these are things that many of the speakers have touched on earlier. But most importantly, I think it's about certainty in the contract and certainty in regulation. So with the uncertainty, I guess they say, why should I put our equity, our debt into a contract and into a market where the final outcome, which could be as long as 25 to 30 years in the future, is uncertain. So these are things which I think we have to work on collectively with government, with all the government agencies, in trying to be clearer and more certain in their contracts in terms of one, what are the provisions that could materially alter these contracts, and number two, how do we regulate both service levels and tariffs moving forward? Because there's a lot of uncertainty actually in the near future given COVID, and we'd have to develop contracts to be able to address these uncertainties moving forward. We can never, as I think Cosette mentioned, that we can never really conceive all the outcomes. Like force majeure 2 years ago was something that we wouldn't pay too much attention to. We'd give it our attention, but we wouldn't say this should dominate the contract. I think moving forward, with the new normal, we do have to really look at force majeure provisions, because the force majeure that we've seen over the past 2 months, if you listen to how the virus will behave, it can come back a year from now, 2 years from now. And this seems to be the new normal, not only as far as COVID, but as far as these global pandemics. They're going to be more prevalent moving forward. And I think the key thing that we'd have to look at is really how do we deal with these force majeure scenarios. And I think if those of you who have looked into the contracts of the current PPP contracts, there's actually probably a lot of work that can be done on the force majeure provisions, which government has considered the standard force majeure provision. I think moving forward, we have to revisit them and say, there is a lot of uncertainty. Nobody really knows when the next pandemic is coming around the corner. But the reality is, these are going to be more frequent and more common in our lifetime, and especially the lifetime of the generations after us. And I think these are the things that when we get down to it, in order to create a PPP beyond the policy but into actual investment, these are some of the features of our contracts and our arrangements with government, which we'd have to focus a lot more on moving forward. So I think these are these are the things that we have to do a bit differently moving forward. And I think we as PPP proponents have to speak collectively to government to say these are the realities of our projects moving forward. And if we speak consistently on these issues, again, unique to each project, but consistent in terms of risk allocation, in terms of how the language is handled, I think this is where we can really lay the groundwork for the private sector really helping in this new post-COVID environment. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Noel, for those points that you've shared. Those are very new, and it's a new development for us. Our next stakeholder reactor is Attorney Romulo Junji Kimbo. Junji, as most people call him, is the Senior Vice President and Head of Communications and Stakeholder Management of Metro Pacific Tollway Corporation. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Junji Kimbo.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, RP and Dindo. And thank you to all the inputs of our distinguished guests and panelists. I have a short slideshow. We'll just pan while I'm explaining something. To start with, it's really necessary that we view toll roads as inevitably a PPP project, for the simple reason that the lands upon which the toll roads are built belong to the government. So from that framework alone, toll roads are already linked via a PPP arrangement. The experience of Metro Pacific Tollways over the past 20 plus years has been an evolution of legal frameworks from maybe as the group already knows, toll roads were privatized as far back as 1977. So you have a 43-year impact in terms of legal framework that has evolved into BOT law and PPP, and all these variations in the concession agreements, whether it's a solicited project, unsolicited project, PPP via the local government code. I think Metro Pacific Tollways has sort of gone through these experiences. So let me just say that at the outset, these projects we are showing you have different contractual arrangements, and thank you for Senator Poe for mentioning some of the critical projects that we're doing. For now, we are focusing on a post-COVID situation or post-ECQ situation, and we realized two things. Number one, expressways, we call ourselves as an enabler. It's a mobility enabler. So it was only heightened in the last several months when we had this crisis. When the lockdown was imposed, 85% of the market collapsed. So we realized very painfully that if people are prevented from moving, prevented from going to their places of work, places of leisure, then obviously you have a very difficult business problem to solve. But during the COVID crisis, we decided to maintain our services, especially on the economic front, when we realized that cargo had to be free-flowing. We are part of the supply chain, and especially when relief goods and food deliveries were critical. We had to keep the expressways open, notwithstanding the challenges. Moving forward, we are looking at, I like the term that Toti Chicamco used. We have to finish the projects that are near the finish line. We have several. I'm showing several projects, the latest of which is our latest connection to R10, which starts at the C3 corner in Caloocan City all the way to Navotas. That will be open in late next month. We hope to do a dry run of the C3 R10 project that will obviously support the incremental growth that we expect when the cargo situation is revived. We're also working hard on the NLEX connector. The NLEX connector has resumed construction. The NLEX connector will cut across Metro Manila from the North Luzon Expressway using the PNR right-of-way. So that is also, that project has also restarted. The third one, maybe just to highlight the message of Senator Poe, is the Cebu Cordova Link Expressway. It's 8 kilometers, and that this will essentially be the third bridge that will connect Cebu mainland with the island of Mactan. Given the development prospects of Cebu International Airport and the economic zones, then we see this CCLEX, as we call it, as a vital link. We hope to restart construction of the other projects shown here in the slides. For now, we're just saying that the PPP program, by the very nature of the legal framework surrounding expressways, are moving on, and we intend to finish them as soon as possible. These are all governed by different concession agreements, and we appreciate the issues that have been presented in terms of improving, modifying by legislation or by contract the impact of a crisis like COVID. Lastly, may I just say that this crisis has also told us that the opportunities for using a digital platform has become more important. So we are focusing now on automating, promoting RFID in the expressway, so that processing will, in terms of manual transactions, we will be reducing the amount of manual transactions at the tollways. We want our customers to feel free, to feel clean, and we assure them that we have prepared for the return when the economy bounces back. That's all from my side, Paco, and thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. We can't wait for things to go back to normal and take a road trip on one of your one of the tollways that the group. So thank you very much, Paul. Next up, so we've heard from a lot of our guests from the private sector. Next up, we'll get some perspectives on PPP from our other guests who have different perspectives, such as Attorney Rico Domingo is our next panelist. Attorney Rico Domingo is the first Vice President of the Philippine Bar Association and professor at the Ateneo School of Law. And we welcome him today to discuss some perspectives, some legal perspectives from him. Attorney Rico.
Thank you, Paco. If I may call you Paco, just because I'm a late inclusion into this panel. May I know the time frame that I'm working under?
Attorney, you have 5 minutes. The whole of 5 minutes.
Yes, you're talking to a lawyer then, huh? Let me just simply compress my discussion because I really prepared for this reaction, but I was fortunate to have already read the the paper of Dr. Torio or Phil, you know. So I'd like to take off from that. But before I proceed, there is a common denominator amongst the previous speakers, no? And thank you very much for inviting us over, incidentally. And Congressman Sarmiento talked about continuity, consistency in contracts. Senator Poe talks about respect for contracts. Mr. Torio, or Dr. Torio, although I missed his large portion of his speech, he said about setting the stage for clearer and more plain stipulations in the contract, which was echoed by Mr. Chiamco, by Mr. Bernardo in his book Momentum, co-author, and of course, Mr. Gonzalez talked about no perfect contract. And of course, Attorney Kimpo was talking about having clearer, reviewing the contracts that have been set in motion right now under the PPP. But let me just quickly tell you why we are contributing right now in this webinar, because we want to give you a legal perspective on the legal ramifications of the profiled risks involved in any contract involving contracts with the government, particularly water concession contracts, for example. And Dr. Torio discussed and defined several risks, and most of them are systemic or systematic risks, which would be involving political, contractual, and regulatory risks. And he defined that in his paper, and I'm sure most of you have already read all those definitions, as well as those observations about risks. So I will not deal with that anymore right now. But what I'm now focusing on would be, there are now plans to review, quote unquote, the existing provisions of the concessionaires. And a number of provisions have been cited as subject to review. We have the prohibition against national government. We have identification of concessionaire with the national government, financial liability of the national government, inclusion of corporate income tax payments, extension of the concessions agreements. All of these have been cited as contractual perils or contractual profile or risks of Dr. Torio. Now, let me just highlight to you how, because our thematic topic here in this particular webinar is entitled How the Sanctity of Contracts and the Rule of Law in Public-Private Partnership would impact on the PPP projects, as well as in the current health crisis occasioned by the pandemic. Now, let me just very quickly tell you what are the provisions of law from the legal standpoint that would be applicable here. And one of them is the principle of sanctity of contracts. And that is enshrined in a 23-word provision in Article 1308 of the new Civil Code. Let's not go about, let's not try to search from any other legal provisions of the law, but we just talk about the basic provisions of the new Civil Code, which has been in existence since 1950s. And Article 1308 says, the contracts must bind both contracting parties. Its validity or compliance cannot be left to the will of one of the contracting parties. Okay? So in the context of that, the principle of mutuality as enshrined in this Article 1308 is intrinsically related to what we perceive to be the rule of law, which is the our motto as well in the Philippine Bar Association. Now how would the rule of law be generated or be espoused by the concept of mutuality, or the principle of mutuality enshrined in that particular article? There is a corollary provision in the law, again under our new Civil Code, Article 1267, Article 1267, the Civil Code, which says, when the service has become so difficult as to be manifestly beyond the contemplation of the parties, the obligor may also be released therefrom, Now, there seems to be a perception that the government right now is trying to renege, to borrow a not so strong word from a lawyer standpoint, to withdraw from the contract that's been existing right now. And the government has to reckon with the standards as well as the postulates under Article 1267. And this applies not only to prestations, because it says service, but it applies intrinsically and by way of judicial interpretation, that applies not only to services, but as well as performance, general performance of obligations, okay? And any attempt under that article to remake, modify, vary, or revise the contract will be in breach of Article 1267, as our Supreme Court held in the leading case of Jesus Oxenia versus Honorable Ramon Hoxon. Okay? So any attempt to renew or to revise, to remake the contract, the onus or the burden is for the government to justify that, as again the Supreme Court held in Naga Telephone Incorporated versus Court of Appeals. So that would be the context of the situation right now. And I understand, given my the time limitation I have, that there is already an arbitral ruling, arbitral award from the permanent permanent court of arbitration of Singapore in favor of one of the water concessionaires. Well, as we all know, arbitration is an alternative mode of resolving disputes. And in recent years, the ADR under arbitration have borne witness to the increasing endorsement by the Supreme Court as a dispute settlement mechanism. And therefore, the arbitral award or arbitral decision as the force of law, not only between the parties, but to the public as well. So in that context, people who are undertaking to review the contractual obligations should be mindful of this jurisprudence as well as the pertinent provisions of the Civil Code of the Philippines. So that ends my short reaction, Paco.
Thank you, Attorney Domingo. Your legal insight is very much appreciated. Now we'll go on to our next set of panelists. Of course, what discussion would be complete without some insight from the civil society sector? So up next we have Mr. Terry Ridon. Terry Ridon is the convener of InfraWatch Philippines, public policy think tank, and he's also a former legislator. Attorney Terry Ridon, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, I can't hear you. Is it just me?
Can you unmute me, please?
There we go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Good morning to Congressman Sarmiento and to Senator Grace-Po. I think very important at this point is for us to discuss first what are the policy gaps that have not yet been resolved during the quarantine. First is that we have not been testing enough. We had not yet reached the daily commitment of 30,000 tests per day. The gap between confirmed and positive cases have not yet been resolved, and it thus prevents us from having a real-time picture of coronavirus transmission, and particularly important to inform policymakers on what urgent actions to take. The death rate of 6% cannot be taken as a singular data point. This should be compared with the worldwide average of around 3%. And particularly, this probably indicates that we are not testing enough and that probably there are thousands more that are left unchecked as positive individuals. All of these are important concerns to make sure that as we ease restrictions and open the economy, we would be preventing an immediate second wave of outbreak. In the last couple of months of quarantine, I think it's very important for us to realize that a problem-driven approach to solving specific issues under community quarantine is required. As an example, if the problem is to bring workers to their workplaces, we cannot simply have a blanket policy of prohibiting jeepneys and buses under quarantines. The DILG has proposed bikes, but certainly this will not be enough for a great number of workers coming from suburban areas, and this would constitute additional costs to already burdened workers. And if we insist on prohibition, the question is, will drivers and operators of jeepneys or buses be eligible for another round of SAP subsidies? There's been no certain answer as yet. There's been no certain answer as of last night. Another question is, if workers go on 50-50 arrangement in their workplaces, who will pay for the remainder of the time that they are not doing productive work? Will government be able to provide cash subsidies for these unworked days? No? And what we have been discussing, what is most important is to ensure fiscal space for social protection as we anticipate another wave outbreak until a vaccine is found. And for infrastructure, this means suspending indicative projects and focusing on grants and loans for social protection and coronavirus response projects and programs. But this means, like what had been previously discussed, continuing already ongoing projects to generate and sustain employment, as a bulk of affected workers in the SAP come from the construction sectors. These are the project-based, usually subcontracted construction workers. This is critical because there's an entire informal economy supporting it. This also means reviewing the current list of flagship infrastructure projects which can be delegated to the private sector as a PPP. More important, this also means a more robust relationship between the government and the private sector. This means honoring the sanctity of contracts, subject to oversight, environment, and social commitments. This means tightening corruption controls at all stages. This means preventing regulatory capture and delay. Basically, governance reforms to boost private sector confidence on government as a reliable partner. With the private sector as an active partner in confronting the coronavirus pandemic, government can focus on what truly matters to the public, control the spread of the disease to an insignificant level, and ensure social protection for our most vulnerable population. Yun lamang po. Maraming salamat.
Thank you. Oh, didn't hear that last part, Attorney Terry. But thank you so much for sharing your insight. Next up, we have another representative. This is Mr. Louis Montemar. Louis Montemar is the convener of a civil society group called Bantay Consumer Calzada Corriente, or BK3. Mr. Louis Montemar, we would appreciate to hear some insights, some reactions from you.
Yeah. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes. So I'm representing BK3. That's Bantay Consumer. It's an advocacy group of consumers. So let me just read out for all a short statement I prepared. Okay. So when I first read the Bayanihan Will as One Act, the main thing that we in BK3 observe is that there is an apparent lack of consideration for what could possibly be a movement or movements of volunteers that would be ready to help out in the generation and mobilization of resources to have those most in need under quarantine conditions. Coming on the heels of the Taal eruption, the nation has seen a deluge of citizen assistance for government relief efforts. One can only wonder why then the public sector seemed to have been unable to learn its lesson on our people's ability to engage and our passion to engage in real bayanihan. Unfortunately, nothing in the Bayanihan Act suggests the need to enable citizens to help out. The Act, it seems, has been more to securitize the issue of the pandemic. Even as the quarantine dragged on, there has only been a related and lukewarm recognition by national government of voluntary efforts under the pandemic, it can then be asked, can government do what needs to be done without volunteer efforts and the private sector? Take note, the government's organization, for instance, of Task Force T3 as a public-private collaboration with support of the ADB, Red Cross, PD, the Ayala Group, and Pangilinan Group, okay, has been done quite late. Task Force T3 was set up 2 months after the quarantine was imposed to boost our capacity to track, trace the virus. Now, aside from bayanihan, collaboration has been one of the magic words in many discussions on the fighting COVID. The magic of collaboration and bayanihan can be seen clearly expressed in the various initiatives of the private sector to help communities from the start of the quarantine, as noted by our senator earlier. A key point that DK3 would like to contribute in this discourse is to qualify that this private sector we are talking about is actually constituted by both profit and non-profit organizations that come in various forms. Civic organizations, there are civic organizations, non-governmental organizations, neighborhood associations, various community associations, and even faith-based organizations. And of course, we have the profit sector, the business corporations. Under many instances, in the past and now in the present pandemic, many of these organizations have been doing more than is expected of them by society. Allow me to share here some initial observations and insights from an online survey that I am conducting with a sociology research team from the PUP regarding groups who are mobilizing to assist our communities under the pandemic. This study clarifies how the government has been remiss in fully harnessing the overwhelming energy of our private sector. Government must proactively enable the private sector to better provide assistance and voluntary services, especially to our most needy citizens and communities. In other words, government can help and should help citizens help themselves. This study suggests that our leaders can do this by, one, these are insights from our study, initial insights. One, government can openly encourage volunteerism and truly consider volunteers as partners rather than expressions of opposition forces sometimes. No? The Bayanihan Act could have provided for the recognition of voluntary initiatives. Number two, directly supporting volunteer efforts, mainly through provision of logistical and technical support, some logistical and technical support. Number three, waiving or at least amplifying registration requirements for volunteer groups, or at least the prompt release of permits and passes, and the easing of restrictions on fundraising. Number four, avoiding politicizing volunteer efforts. And lastly, coordinating volunteer efforts to maximize their impact on our communities and strengthening this by putting in place an information, education, and communication campaign that particularly complements private sector efforts. Okay, so those 5 main points, I think, can easily be done by government to further maximize what we are calling bayanihan or collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Louis Montemar, for your insights. That's Mr. Louis Montemar from Bantay Consumer, Casada, and Corriente. Next up, we have our next panelist, Mr. Orlando Oxales. Mr. Orlando Oxales is the convener of Citizen Watch Philippines, a citizen-led consumer group.
Hi, it's almost noon, and first, I'd like to thank Stratbase ADRi for again giving us the opportunity to partner with this forum. Stratbase ADRi and Citizen Watch have been together in many forums, and we are really very happy to have an as ally Strat-based ADRi, of many of our advocacies which directly affect the consumers. First, we'd like to recognize the private sector's contribution to alleviate the plight of vulnerable communities, especially during the first weeks of this lockdown. Actually, this actually demonstrates the nimbleness in mobilizing its human and financial resources, its efficiency, its being results-oriented, and actually that's the very nature of the private sector. Listening to all the discussions and even before, we have been very supportive of PPP as a strategy for especially what the government is trying to do now, their BBB projects. We agree that this will free up government resources that can be redirected to fight the spread of COVID-19 and assist all of these interventions that would strengthen first our public health system, well, not just food dollars, which are also important, but we see an important need to help our micro, small, medium businesses. They need help, and they are the sectors that employ most of our workforces. Those who are calling no work, no pay workers. They're the majority of our workforce and the majority of the consumers. This is the reality. It's the private sector's innovative and focus on productivity that has always been the prime driver of the economy. That's the truth. All these taxes come from employees, and the employers are the private sectors. This is the primary source of government resources. They come from our salaries, our hard-earned work, and all of these have to be run by private businesses. We agree that our economy must be opened up. We need big investments that will create industries, that will create for us long-term investments, not just what we need are really quality, big investments that will create quality employment, create industries that will not just be here in Metro Manila, but can be located in the other areas of our country. Unfortunately, this lockdown has affected many sectors. Just to mention a few: construction, education, repair services, tourism especially, finance and insurance, the entertainment industry and recreation, sports, even professional and scientific and technical activities, real estate, all of them have been disrupted and are almost at a standstill. According to government estimate, these sectors alone are going to lose about 1.1 million jobs. The lockdown is projected to push unemployment rate to about 10.2% by the second quarter of 2020, or approximately 4.6 million unemployed. So in response, the government is providing about 205 billion pesos for social amelioration, emergency subsidy, 51 billion for small business employees, wage subsidy for a total of 256 billion pesos. Actually, the NEDA estimates 846 billion pesos will be needed as initial stimulus for both budget and non-budget intervention policies for recovery programs. All of these will need funding, understandably. And perhaps, well, actually already anticipating negative revenues, part of it because of the CREATE bill that's going to be passed, which they estimate to be about 1 trillion by 2022. The government is proposing to raise some existing taxes and even impose new taxes. Yes, more taxes for everyone. Already a 10% temporary tariff increase on fuel has already been implemented, and a new bill increasing motor vehicles users tax every year has passed in second reading in the House of Representatives. They will propose the indexation of, again, of sweetened beverage tax of 6%. If you remember, when the last time they did it in Train 1, there was inflation and millions of sari-sari store owners were affected. Actually, now in this crisis, thousands of sari-sari stores are closed, and a big bulk of them won't open again. And now also, they also want to tax the digital economy with a value-added tax that will be posed on e-commerce. Well, they're probably banking on the Philippine e-commerce, which is now reaching about 200 billion by 2020. Government wants to tax this market, which has been growing at the rate about more than 100% since a few years ago. But this is going to be at the expense of ordinary Filipinos who are mostly unbanked and pay cash on delivery. That's an innovation here of e-commerce. Micro entrepreneurs are actually just learning to operate home-based online stores. And this is very discouraging move for an ecosystem that we should actually be nurturing because of its access to more than 70 million internet users. Imagine that. Users of the country that works well even for our social distancing restrictions right now. Well, the only agreeable tax measure for us really is the POGO tax, which if it happens, I'm sure will be very popular. As usual, it will be us, the already stressed out and locked down, fatigued taxpayers who will be burdened. New taxes, especially at these times, will just fan frustration and distrust with the government. Why not focus on unleashing our suppressed potential by trashing overly protectionist policies? Experts have been talking about this all the time. These have stymied the country's attractiveness for quality long-term investments that all economies will actually be aggressively competing for. They will be wanting all this capital to finance their own economic recovery. And well, the only way this will happen is if governance and our regulatory environment will inspire trust, confidence for the long-term partnerships. Thank you, that's all.
Thank you, Orly, for those insights. We now move to our open forum. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A section of the chat. I'll start off with, is Congressman Edgar Sarmiento still here?
I'm still here. Robert, yeah.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
They wanted, we have a question here because they wanted to know how the EDSA rapid business bus rapid transit formula will work. I think this was discussed by Mr. Eddie Yap, and I know this was one of your advocacies as well with the Department of Transportation.
They're going to implement that as soon as time, and that's right. Mr. Yap is here. Is very right. Secretary Artugad is informed the president about the plan. They're going to test it sooner. It's going to augment the train, since train will only take in around 20%. The excess passengers will take the bus. There's an access there. I think there are 15 total stops from Monumento down to MOA. It's going to be like a carousel. 600 buses will be filled in specifically for EDSA. Shorter routes, but better connection. It will cut down the travel time around easily from a high of 4 hours. We're looking at, I'm hoping, around an hour, 30 minutes. That will save passengers total of maybe 3 hours, 4 hours of quality time as compared to 8 hours. Maybe this time we can save on what is being repeatedly said, 3.5 economic losses a day. It's a well-studied thing, and I hope this one, it will be executed well.
Thank you, Kong. Any more insights, Mr. Yap?
Please unmute. Okay.
Yes, sir. You're now.
May I respond? Let me say that these busways at the innermost lanes is the universal standard for
Sir, could you speak louder, please?
Busways at the innermost lanes is the universal standard. And the proof of concept has been established. The bus rapid transit was started in Cordova 47 years ago. And since then, by 2018, 146 systems are in operation worldwide, carrying over 30 million passenger trips per day. So I am very confident that anything other than the yellow bus lanes that we had will be a very, very big improvement. And it's going to ensure that the buses will keep on running provided they're properly controlled and supervised, and that the headway is maintained. I understand that during peak hours, the headway will be just a little over 1 minute, and during other hours, it will be 3 minutes. Now, the buses, because of their low capacity, what we have are small buses with only about 40 passengers capacity. They must operate like a train, like a platoon, a row of buses, about 4. Now, let me share with you information. I am closely in touch with the DOTR team working on this. They're working very hard, and that the bus operators, most of them have already agreed among themselves to divide the routes in Metro Manila, and all the 4,600 buses will participate. In Metro Manila, nobody will be left out. Now, in fact, I was invited to the dry run, which will happen very soon. What is being done now is to lay the dividers, the lane dividers, so that the busway will be isolated from other traffic. I'm optimistic. Change is coming to EDSA. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Kong Edgar, we have another question for you. Congressman Sarmiento.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Kong, a question that's here is, do we have data on how many current infrastructure projects are in ODA and how many are PPP?
Well, there are, I think, on the flagship project of the executives, there are a total of 100. I think ODA is somewhere at 49. General Appropriation Act, there is some 22 rapid, and we have for PPP, there's somewhere 14. Then there are unsolicited proposals that are subject to approve on the 15. Then this is very important, as again, I want continuity on what government is doing. And if ever I will still be given that opportunity as a public servant, and this is very important, I want to make sure to address the gap, as was mentioned by one of the reactors, clearly to make sure that the PPP program of government will go on successfully. This time, it has to be legislated so that whatever issues we had before will be contingent. I'm hoping that somebody on the next members of the House will continue the same. But I'll try to do everything to close the gap now, so that issues, again, that we had on PPP and all other issues relevant to infrastructures can be legislated, protecting the interests of investors.
Thank you, Kong. We have a questions for our economists, Sir Toti and Sir Romy. Who would like to answer first? It's about what is your opinion on public-private partnerships in agricultural projects or agricultural development? Sir Toti, Sir Romy. Unmute si Toti.
Yeah, okay. Well, offhand, I really can't think of anything right now on PPP for agricultural projects. I said that the problem in agriculture now is really more of property rights. It's really the need to do land consolidation. So, and that's what the government can probably best do for agriculture. Right now, it's not profitable to go into agriculture. So no private sector will propose a PPP for many reasons why it's not profitable. One is, as I said, the restrictions on CARP, so you're limited only to 5 hectares. Secondly, of course, the infrastructure, the rural infrastructure, which cannot be done in PPP because it's not profitable for the private sector to do that. Thirdly, there's a problem of crop insurance. It's very risky really to go into agriculture with all these weather disturbances and climate change. So we have to the government has to fix the crop insurance system. Finally, of course, because of the transport costs, it's shipping from farm to market is very expensive, and therefore that's the reason why we also need the Public Service Act, is to have competition and have more investments in the distribution, in the supply chain logistics from the farm to the market.
Thank you, Toti. Romy, Sir Romy.
Yes, just very briefly, I think Cosette would like to answer that question, but very quickly on my end, I agree that there are a lot of problems in the agricultural sector of a fundamental policy nature. And I think this administration had begun to address them. For example, on the whole rice importation issue. But there are still problems relating to property rights and ability of investors to have control over large tracts of land to make efficient plantation agriculture possible, which is really the only way you can compete in the world market. So here perhaps, I don't know if you call it PPP, but government still controls public lands. So I don't know if you can have some arrangements where government conveys such public lands to investors for a fixed period of time. I think that was what was done in the 70s that gave birth to the banana and pineapple plantation. I think NDC and some other companies, public companies, signed long-term agreements. No? Maybe that's something that's possible under as a PPP. I know Toti Kiamco has talked about amending the forestry laws so that we can actually encourage more industrial forest plantations. That might be an area as well where a PPP structure or a JV structure might be possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Romy. I'll pass it on now to Cosette. Thank you for volunteering to answer this question.
Yeah, sorry, but you know, I just had to step in. When I was still with the PPP Center, we actually developed two projects that are very critical to what's happening right now. I really hope that progressed. Then we would have mitigated some impact of this COVID. The first one was we developed a project for DA, which is in food logistics, including cold storage, all the way from Benguet to Manila and to some parts of southern Luzon. So that was set aside in favor of a Korean ODA, I think. So maybe government can revisit that, and I think that's very critical in developing the agri sector. The other project that is quite relevant right now is we developed also, we did a feasibility study on developing the capability of RITM to develop vaccine, to manufacture vaccines. But again, that was set aside in favor of GPRA, so GPRA, or government funding. So I don't know what happened to that one, and I hope government can revisit that. We also looked at digitalizing PhilHealth, which would have, also improved the healthcare systems that we have right now. We successfully bid out during my time the modernization of the Philippine Orthopedic Hospital, which could have been a very good template on how to privatize, how private sector could come in and improve the government hospitals. So those are the projects that I hope government can revisit and look at, so that we're more we can address future pandemics or situations like what we're in right now. Another thing I think in the short term that the private sector can really help government now is in the national ID. I think government, although there's already funding allotted for national ID, I still believe that the private sector has the efficiency and I think a little bit of flexibility in ensuring that the national ID and the enrollment of people can be done in a shorter period of time. That's it for me. Thank you.
Cosette, I have another question for you since you're still at it. You mentioned about hospitals. We have a question here from our participants. Could you give them a brief what happened to the PPP of the public hospitals in the previous government? Because they were asking what happened to those projects.
Yeah, the biggest one that the only one I think that we wanted. But during the last admin, we wanted to do PPP projects for several sectors so that it could become a template, right? And we had one for the healthcare sector, which is the modernization of the Philippine Orthopedic Center. That was actually bid out and awarded and signed even by the private proponent. But I think the new secretary that took over, the new health secretary that took over had some issues and that didn't happen. So let's see, but I hope they could revive that.
Sure, okay. Thank you, Cosette. I'll pass my question now to our stakeholders from the private sector, namely Christian Gonzalez, Noel, and Junji. We have a question here in how open is the business sector on doing public-private partnerships with the local government units. Who wants to answer first? Junji?
Maybe RBI can jump in.
Oh, okay.
This is Noel. Yeah,
okay.
very quick.
Okay.
Yeah, very quickly. I think the major concern with local government units is actually the tenure of the mayors in these government units. So it's a 3-year cycle, which is obviously very short for any infrastructure project. And moreover, it goes back to the principal question of continuity, and how do we ensure that the contract, which was signed by the mayor and the council at the time, outlives the political term of these people. So that's really the major concern. And I think maybe from a legislative point of view, that could be addressed as well. Hopefully, I'm not too familiar with the latest draft in the PPP amendments, but I think this is something that could be addressed from a legislative point of view, because there are a lot of opportunities actually with the bigger local governments, and they actually do have the financial capability and wherewithal to help finance these projects on a solicited basis. But then it goes back to the issue of bankability of contract, certainty of contract, which I think, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is some of the powers that are available to them under the local government code actually allows them to reverse some of these contracts. So I think these are some of the issues that for the private sector to look at the bigger projects in these communities, that's what would have to be addressed either through legislation or some other form of policy adjustment.
Thank you, Noel.
I can jump in, RP.
I'll allow Junji first, Chris, then.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, RP. In our experience with Metro Pacific Tollways, we have a live PPP contract with the local government. That is the Cebu Cordova Link Expressway project. And that was awarded in the previous local government administration. We have looked at the local government code and the PPP code that each of these LGUs crafted, and we found them to be satisfactory, addressing the major risks that we believed were inherent in a local government project. And so far, the project is doing well. And the new local governments that have taken over since then are supporting the project. And it also helps that very little or if minimal right of way is concerned, is involved. And hence there's a minimal issue as to whether or not local populations will be unjustly or unnecessarily disturbed or relocated. So far our experience has been okay insofar as the PPP for local governments is concerned. Thanks.
Chris?
Yeah, I think going forward, we're certainly keen on having more local government participation. I mean, whether as part of a PPP project or through some form of regulation. I mean, ports are generally seen as inconveniences to local governments and the people residing within them. And in order to bridge that gap, you really do have to bring the local government in one way or another. Now, how they would participate in a port PPP remains to be seen, at least a major one. But again, we're most certainly willing to look at it.
Thanks, Chris. I have a question here for Dr. Torrio.
Is there?
Okay. Your analysis is that the two water concessionaires have performed quite well the past 27 years, for which reason fund lenders could ease up loan conditions in the future. How will this possibly affect the so-called onerous provisions in the future if government decides to extend the concession contracts?
Well, I think the concessionaires at this point in time, they have a very healthy financial balance sheet already. At the start of the concession, we had to provide, at that time, the banks required a lot of comfort because this was new, there was no benchmark. But over the years, you've seen how the concessionaires have already performed, and you've seen their balance sheets, they're very healthy balance sheets. And as such, I think the concessionaires would be in a position to negotiate some of these terms already with the government. I think what the government needs to do is not to intimidate the concessionaires, but to sit down with them and discuss properly the terms that they want, or the provisions that they want to review. For example, the provision on non-interference by the national government on tariff issues and implementation of approved tariffs, that I think is very easy to negotiate with the concessionaires. In the first place, the government, there's nothing the government that cannot do. The government may always interfere, but this was wording that was provided before to provide comfort for the lenders. And if you take that away, the loss that would have been accruing to the national government also fades away. And what you would probably be left with an agreement with the MWSS as a subnational government agency instead of directly with the national government. And I believe the concessionaires right now have a very healthy balance sheet and are in a position to be able to negotiate this, or probably give some leeway on these provisions, which have been deemed onerous by the national government.
Thank you, sir. I have one last question for Congressman Sarmiento.
I'm here.
Okay. Sir, one of our attendees are asking about the bus rapid transit project again. What is your opinion on consolidating the bus operators and even jeepney operators? How will this affect the present setup between the business, meaning about the bus operator and us, the riding public?
This system right now is a well-studied system, ARP. It's a program by the Department of Transportation. I know about the project, but I have to wait for the official statement or pronouncement of Secretary Abtugadi, which he did last night. Now, this is in terms of hierarchy. We have to start from the train now to the buses. Of course, everybody, all the bus owners are part of these. The 4,600, as was mentioned by Mr. Yap. There are the route rationalized areas in Metro Manila. I think it's going to help everyone, the drivers, the bus operators, and the riding public. However, as a public servant, my main concern is the mobility of the masses. I want them to have the quality time, and what is stated, the number is that's 4 hours in the morning, quality time loss because of traffic, and another 4 hours in the evening, a total of 8 hours. With this system, I'm hoping this will work. We're gonna test it. We might cut it down to half, or maybe we can give them 5 hours of quality time. I think that is already successful. I'm hoping that they can have the system running the soonest time.
Thank you, Kong.
You're welcome.
I think that's it for our questions. On behalf of the Strat-based ADRi and our civil society organization partner, Citizen Watch, we would like to thank all of our participants, our speakers, our reactors for joining us. One thing that we've learned today that we really need, in order for public-private partnership to work, whether it's B2B, DOT, whatever we may want to call it, we still need to have a stable regulatory environment and respect for the sanctity of contracts and rule of law. And we also need good governance. On behalf of the Strat-based group, we would like to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you as well. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.